in our community, it's more of a collective responsibility to console one who has lost a beloved one. You are not left all alone, no. And even after some time, as they will still be coming to you to check on you, how things are going. So it's a responsibility that is shared by the entire community.
Welcome to Unlikely Gifts, a podcast for anyone looking for hope amid difficult circumstances. Life can be beautiful, unexpected, and at times profoundly difficult. It helps to hear from others who have grown from life's challenges and joys. That's why Leonard and Cynthia Bauer are sharing how their experiences working with families impacted by disabilities in Africa have taught them about life's most amazing gifts and its hardest tragedies. These are Unlikely Gifts.
Hello, and welcome back to Unlikely Gifts. I'm Frank Boswell, and I'm joined by Cynthia Bauer and Leonard and the co-founders and directors of an organization called Copenda for the Children. You know, we've been covering issues of healing and death and suffering. It's kind of heavy topics for a conversation, and never far away from that, it has to be the experience of grief, the kind of people with disabilities and the things that surround that. Grief is the experience of great loss. Reading a book by Clarissa Mall, she says it's a journey no one wants to take. We could probably add to that, sooner or later, everyone gets to take that journey. And I wondered, what's the most recent example of grief that comes to mind for you?
I think that a lot of times when we think of grief, we're usually thinking about it's a loss, often a loss of a loved one. It was interesting, it comes to mind because it's just recent. I was just out of town to go to the funeral of a friend's father, and he had had a full life. He was 92. He was at peace. He was surrounded by his family when he left this world. And my friend just this last week, and it's the first time she's lost a parent or someone close to her like that in the family. And she's like, it's very strange. She said, I know he's died, but it just doesn't feel like he's died. I'm like, well, that's actually part of grief, is that's actually a denial. It's a strange part of it. Like when you start to go through some of the stages of grief, grief has lots of different expressions. And I think when we first lose someone, there is that stage of it doesn't feel like it's real. It's kind of a numb part of it, but that's still grief. I think most people think of grief as crying, which is actually only a very small part of it, because grief includes anger, grief includes numbness, grief includes, other coping mechanisms, and different people express it in different ways too. But I think with just the loss of her dad, just just seeing her in that phase. And I lost my dad 30 years earlier than she lost hers. My dad was 63 when he passed. And so I remember shortly after my dad died, there was a weird feeling of I felt almost scared, which was very strange too. And I remember reading C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. He said, no one told me that grief felt so much like fear. And it was because there's I think when you really go through a traumatic loss, and when I lost my dad, I had also lost a relationship. I had also been 40, so the idea of children. So I was grieving a lot of things all at once. And it felt kind of scary in a way. I think that, and I think sometimes in our deepest grief, sometimes we can feel a sense of abandonment even from God. And I think that's also a surprising thing to feel, because not everyone has experienced grief at certain stages, or at least extreme grief. And so when it happens, I think people get surprised by some of those emotions. What about you, Leonard?
Thank you, Cindy. I think the recent grief I went through is when I lost my uncle. And at the same time, I lost Brian, one of our sponsored children who was living with vascular dystrophy. These two deaths happened at the same time. But I want to see what was really paining me when it came to Brian. Brian was a very close boy, was very talkative. We could share a lot with him. but I would see him really in pain when we visited him at his home. And then after a few days, whatever happened, I don't know, but we were just told that this boy has just died this night. But I could relate it to the type of disability because by then he had a lot of breathing problems. So it's like these the muscles of the heart were now becoming weak and the lungs were also very, very weak. And on the other side, when I lost my uncle within the same short duration of about 2 days, this is an uncle who really took care of me in terms of education. This is an uncle who even helped us when we were doing one of the videos, which was telling more about disability. And he really gave us a lot of information. And during the time he was almost dying, it's like he wanted me to be there. So I received a call and I went there. He was really in pain. But as I was there, it was less than an hour when my uncle died. It really, really pained me. And I remember the words he said it to me really made me to shed tears because he said, you see, my uncle, I have worked with you for a long time. And now time has come because he was around in 92 years. He said, time has come for me to join my people who died many years ago. So it's like, what is this? But within a short time, this uncle of mine died. It was very painful. But on the other side, I could also see the input he had done here on earth was wonderful because he was a counselor. He did so many good things to people within his community, including me. In fact, most of his family members said I was the biggest beneficiary from my uncle.
So grief isn't just something you observe in the people that you're working with, but if you truly love them, then you are subject to grief and over from the sound of things.
Someone once asked me, she was interviewing me, I think, for a paper about Kupenda stuff. And she asked me, how do you do this work without it breaking your heart? And I said, oh, you make an assumption that it doesn't. I'm like, at the point at which this work and when we lose a child, at the point at which it doesn't break our hearts, it's the point at which we should stop doing the work. Because it does. Our hearts get broken every day. Because unfortunately, the type of children we work with are very vulnerable and they're going to die. And I actually was the first child that I met. His name was Chiroshita. He was one of the first ones that died. And I just happened to be going to Kenya right before his burial. And I was able to speak at his service. And I remember not being sure about what it was going to be like when I was there. And it was my first experience actually of a funeral. And I think that in some ways I appreciated how Kenyans grieve, where they come together and they have literal mourners that sit around the body of the person. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but when I saw his face, they lifted up, they had like a little flap on the coffin where you can see the person's face because of the humidity. They had like a glass covering. And I started crying, I started weeping, and all these women all around, they all started weeping and wailing too, just like the mourners in the Bible. And I don't know, there was something about that, of the people all just like joining one another in sorrow for the loss of this child. And it was a child whose death maybe could have been prevented. He had epileptic fits and something was happening with him not getting the medication while one of the head teachers was away at that time. Leonard recently said, like, every time when he just lost a child, that is a time of grief. And also, I think because we can come alongside in the grief with the families that are losing these children. And also there's grief that's not just death, but like there's grief around disability. When someone becomes disabled or has a child with a disability, they're also going through that grief process.
C.S. Lewis has a famous passage, and he talks about our choices either to shut ourselves off so we don't get hurt or to love people, in which case you are vulnerable, you will certainly be hurt. And it's just a tough choice, Do you think it's different for different people, different circumstances, or is grief the path pretty much the same for everybody? What's been your experience?
I think it's so important that, especially when it comes to loss, whether it's the loss of a person, the loss of like a disability or something like that, you have to grieve, whatever that might mean, because our grief, especially when it comes to losing a person, is a reflection of our love for that person. And so we grieve because we love. And the bigger our love, the bigger our grief because of that loss. And so, in a way, to grieve someone is a gift because that means we loved that big.
It honors them. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Leonard,
I also agree with Cindy. Grief is a sign of love, and whether you knew the person or not, but as you join the mourners, you will also have that feeling of grief, and you can even burst to tears along with the others. However, it is more severe, or it is more pronounced when you work with a child very close with him for many, many years. So it's like there is that attachment with the child because you have been supporting the child either at the school or at the home just because of the many challenges he was having. So when you use such a child, your grief becomes so deep because you're looking at that connection you've been having with that child.
So your closeness to somebody, your investment in their lives, intensifies that experience of grief.
Exactly.
So what about healing? Is grief something you heal from? I've heard and read different things on this. Do you get over grief, or do you just learn to look at it in a different way? Can you speak to that whole thing?
I think that when I lost my niece, it's almost 2 years. On February 10th, it'll be 2 years since Ellie was gone. And she went through cancer for 4 years. I was very part of it, and it's still hard. It always is going to be hard. There's grief, and one of the things I was trying to look at when we lost her is I was actually analyzing myself and my own emotions to look at the difference, because I think when my dad passed and that relationship and all kinds of things were happening at the same time, it triggered like a pretty major depressive episode in my life for the next couple of years. And I was actually looking at the differences between depression and grief, which there are differences. And so, and what I was realizing, and I even at the time was seeing a counselor, I was like, okay, so this is the normal response. This is grief. It's not necessarily like, where grief comes in waves, I think. And over time, I think that what I've experienced and what many other people have experienced is over time, you still feel it, but maybe the waves aren't as close together. Sometimes those waves are just as big when they happen, but they're further apart. And I think getting used to a loss, I don't know if you're always necessarily grieving, but you're learning how to live. I think that someone once, a few people have used this analogy in that loss anyway is similar to like losing a limb. Like you lose the person, but and you lose a limb. Eventually you learn how to do things, but you do them differently. You'll never not recognize that your limb is gone, but you'll dance, you'll laugh, but it's never quite the same. And I think that's the thing. I think some people think of things like moving on, getting over it. I always hate those terms. I'm like, because it's just, you're different. You'll never be the same. Like my brother will never be the same after losing his daughter. We'll never be the same after losing my niece. And those parents that we have or who have children with disabilities, like they're not going to be the same. And that's okay. And it's like, but you learn to live with things not being the same, and it becomes a part of you. You almost absorb that grief into you and who you are as a person. And try to do it in a healthy way, because it can make us cynical and angry too, because that's part of grief too.
Anything to add to that, Leonard, or is that?
Yeah, I think grief is something that you cannot get out of it very fast. You will have to learn how to cope with it. Many times it will still cope in. I remember the time I lost my mom way back in 2003. But still, that grief sometimes comes in, and you take like a few moments thinking of you are my mom, and it pays. But at least you learn a way of living with the situation. So it's true. You just need to come up with a way of living with the situation. And again, you find that there are so many children that we attend to bury them, and that is really causing a lot of grief to us. You could imagine even at a time when we get into a family where a child has passed on and we are going to bury, you find that after the burial, as we live there, even at our workplace, it's like the entire week will not be as a comfortable week as the other weeks, because you find all the staff are briefed by the loss of one of the children we were really close to, we were serving in our program. But with the time, it goes out slowly unless somebody has mentioned it in the office, or as you are looking at the documents, particularly the names that you come across, oh, so and so, or this child died so many years ago. Then it's like something is coming into your mind and you feel like, oh. So that's how it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what would you say helps people along this path? How do you help people who are grieving? And I suppose the flip side of that is what doesn't help. What should we not do?
Well, one of the things I think I personally think is important, I think we want to avoid grief, and I just don't think you can, and I don't think it's healthy. And I think what you do when you try to almost skip the process of avoiding it, it's going to make it worse because it's building up and it'll come out in very unhealthy ways. I've watched people you can be very busy. I think that's one of the things in America. Between the time that a person dies and the funeral, there's this week right after the person dies, and all of a sudden you're just busy because you're planning it. There's all these people around, you're avoiding it. And eventually you almost have to take time to set aside to just let yourself grieve. I know that there have been times in my life, I remember even just the most recent loss I have had, which was of my niece. And the day after her service, I just sat by myself and just went through pictures and just had to just have my own time to just be sad, to just cry. And I think that I don't think, and even I was telling my friend who just lost her dad, who was saying she didn't feel it yet. I'm like, I just hope that you give yourself time to feel it, because to not feel it as hard, it feels terrible, but at the same time, it's important part of the process. To just yeah. What do you think? Do you think that's true, Leonard?
Yeah, that's true. In fact, from our perspective on the African side, we say that when somebody is grieving, you need to give him time to go through the entire process. If you try to block it, then that will not be a good solution, because it will come back in another form or in a bigger way. And we also combine it with the fact that when we have lost someone, it is also good for you to be able, one, to see that body. It helps you because you are going, immediately you see the body, you are going to cry so much. And that is also a process of accepting the situation, as opposed to not even seeing the body before burial. It will really pain you, and that grief is likely to stay with you for a long time.
I'm thinking of in early American history, right? They had grieving clothes. They had periods of mourning and grieving, and there was space set aside for that. I don't think we have any of that today in North America. I mean, I would imagine Africa has more wisdom. But if you have mourners coming around, and just listening to you, Leonard, it sounds like there's an awareness that people need space and time to grieve. Is that fair to say?
Yes, they need to be given time. That's why you see people yelling, crying, and it's because of the modern way of life. Otherwise, traditionally, there was a system where after you have buried someone, you will wait for a certain period of time, maybe after 1 year or so, you are coming together again to grieve together towards the loss of that person. And truly that was coming to a healing process, accepting the situation. And from there, you were quite okay. And even the most close people to the person you lost, they were dressed in a special way to show that these people are grieving of the loss of one of their beloved one.
So maybe you've already answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do people get stuck in grief?
No, I think that that's an interesting question. I think that with grief and the grieving process, there's not a timetable. However, and different people have different ways. I think that that's where there's that difference between grief and like going into, say, clinical depression, right? That where it kind of almost locks you in there. I think that one of the things that I know is helpful is understanding that you're not the only one. And I think that's what we do a lot with Kupenda is help people understand they're not alone in their grief. They're not the only people who are grieving, who've gone through that loss. And I think there's a point at which I think it was Johnny Erickson Tata said, and I think I might have quoted it before when we were talking about suffering, but I think that there's, and it goes with healing and everything else. When one of the things that I've found to help with the grieving process is when you do come alongside other people who are also grieving and to help them, and you can, and I think that that helps you to not, I don't know if stuck is the word, but yeah, it helps you to move forward and progress and live your life. I think that grief, you have to take that time out, but at a certain point, you have to enter back into life again. I think that's the thing. Like, I think someone once said to say to people who say you can get over it or have closure are people who haven't had extreme loss, because that's just not how it works. But there is a way to learn how to live and learn how to live differently and to honor the person who was lost. Or when it comes to, say, a disability, if you're grieving the loss of ability or you're grieving the loss of the child you thought you were going to have, and yet your child has a disability, it's like, okay, learning that this is different. It's not what I wanted, but how to now let's go forward and figure out how this can be part of life, and learning how life looks different.
Because when I want to use a very recent example where one mother lost her husband and she cried. She was so much in grief, such that you could not even control her. But what other ladies did, she was approached by two ladies who had already experienced the loss of their husband. And these are the ladies who talked to her to a point that this lady had to cool down and even at least listen to what the people were saying. And this is the trend that many of our communities do. When one is having a big grief, particularly has lost a very close one, a husband, a wife, and so on, the community would look for old women who have gone through such experiences to come and talk to her. And that really, really helps someone to get out of that grief.
In what ways do you think Christian faith affects grieving, speaks to grieving, or helps people grieve?
There are times for me in the church when we lose a person that sometimes, I'll just say sometimes, I think that we have hope that the person, is with God, and that lessens it to some extent. But sometimes I feel like when people talk about that a lot and how their loved one is in heaven, it's almost like they're trying to tell people not to grieve. I'm like, but we still got to do that part too. Like, yeah, okay, but they're not here now. And, I think that even knowing that Christ in the garden, I mean, he cried tears of blood. He was that sorrowful. I think that to know that grief is also what Jesus did. Yeah, he was the
Isaiah calls him the man of sorrows. Right?
Yeah, I think to know that, I think somehow people think that faith means you're supposed to be happy all the time, which is actually not true. I mean, if you truly open your eyes to like the brokenness of this world, it's heavy and you need to feel it. So I think that when we look, I think my brother said, when we talked about when he was praying for his daughter and believed that she was going to be healed, he had to get a new Bible when she died because he just underlined everything about healing. And then in this new Bible, he's like, I realized that it's so full of suffering. He's like, I don't know why I didn't see it before. And I think that
That's
suffering and
interesting.
grief all kind of goes together. You know, you have company anyway.
Yeah, he was acquainted with grief, Isaiah says. And Paul says we need to grieve with hope. So we're actually commanded to grieve. But it's true. Christians do have this way sometimes of cosmetizing it and, trying to get rid of the discomfort of being around a grieving person rather than grieve with them.
I actually think, and Leonard, tell me if you think this is true. I actually think it's quite an American or Western concept. Because the thing that's crazy to me, and every time I go to a funeral in the United States, it just reminds me of how crazy it is like when we lose a person, we're meant to put on a show, basically, the funeral. Like, I wrote the obituary the day after my father died. We stood in a line for 4 hours while people came through to greet our family. We had to stand there, and we were the ones that were basically hosting all these people, and they were usually the ones crying while we're comforting them. And I just think that and we're actually not to show emotion, basically, it seems. And like, people always say, oh, well, they're in a better place, all that stuff. I'm like, because people just don't want to see you sad. Whereas in Kenya, like I said, it's the idea that as soon as I started crying, they all started crying. To me, that feels better. That feels like the right way to grieve.
So I'm speaking of my own pet peeve now as a pastor, but everybody wants that. They don't want a funeral anymore. They want a celebration of life. We're going to come together and remember all the good things. And sometimes it almost takes on a party atmosphere. And I just fear we're really, really missing something that we should schedule a time and place and a liturgy to be able to grieve and give expression of that. So I wonder, what do you think grief teaches us?
Before we go to what grief teaches us, I think I have something to share. In our society, grief is for when someone is grieving, he needs to be comforted. And the comforters are the neighbors within that community who come and grieve with you. And when you are crying, these people come to console you and say, hey, we know what you are going through. It's very difficult, but try to understand the situation and so on. So they are trying to console you as you go through that grief. And also still during that grief, it is a one way that people will come and sit closer to you or with you. And they may even take 3 days or even 5 days. A big part of that group that is helping you consoling you. So in our community, it's more of a collective responsibility to console one who has lost a beloved one. You are not left all alone. No. And even after some time, as I've already said, they will still be coming to you to check on you, how things are going on. Maybe you are still so down. They will give you a word of encouragement. So it's a responsibility that is shared by the entire community.
So we need other people to come alongside, not to explain it away, but to support us and help us face the magnitude of the loss. We really can't even do that all by ourselves. That's interesting. Well, what do you think we learn as a result of going through that and acknowledging and incorporating grief into our lives?
I think it helps us to connect, for me, to the rest of the world. To remember that the
grieving world.
Yeah, a grieving world. I remember when my family has had some tragedies. I remember when it must have been, I don't know how long ago it was now. My uncle, my dad's brother, died in a plane crash, a little plane down in Florida, delivering supplies to an orphanage, actually, with a pastor. And on the way back, they hit another plane head on. And I remember when I was going into work, I said, I have to go to a funeral in Florida, so I'll be gone for a few days. My uncle died of a plane crash. Like, wait a minute, I saw that on the news. Yeah. I was like, I never think about that happening to someone I know. I'm like, yeah, because I think we see all these tragedies and these horrible things out in the world, and you forget that that's actually someone's sister or parent or or spouse that happened to. And I think that it's an interesting response that person's like, I didn't think of that happening to someone that I know. I'm like, well, these do. And I think that I think until you go through extreme loss and grief, you think of it as this is stuff that happens to other people, um, not to us. And then you realize, oh wait, this is part of us as well. And yeah, it helps you to more connect fully to other people, to love, to come alongside other grieving people. What do you think, Leonard?
Well, when you hear or you see people grieving or you are also grieving, I think it is also telling us that grieving is not meant for a particular person. It happens to anyone in this world. Because I could hear the story of Cindy when she lost her dad, and it was very sad. But again, on the other side, when I also lost the relatives, came to realize, oh, so grief is something that is cutting across the entire world. And also, when you go through a lot of grief, you learn how to cope. And this is why you'll find in our community all the people who have experienced grief for many, many times. Whenever someone dies and the people are grieving, you will find that how he grieves is not as that serious as a young person who has never had such an experience. So it's like they develop a coping mechanism for grief. And I think that is what we should be able to apply even to our work, because all the time we shall hear of such cases happening, but we should also learn how to cope with those situations and even how to assist or help those who are also going through very serious grief. Like the parents will be having a very serious grief after losing one of their beloved one. We should be there and we should be able to help them so that at least the grief they are going through is not as much as they would expect. And I have many experiences where we use one of our children and the parents see a group of Kohenza staff walking into that home. We have seen what it really happened or what it gives to the parents, like, oh, so you have come to be part of me. And I tend to believe at least that grief is a little bit reduced in the sense that he has seen people who are always close to the child, who have been working with the child together. So these are part of the people who are working with my child. I think that one also helps in helping people for the serious thing.
I think I've also learned having experienced grief, I have patience for other people who are going through it, because grief, again, is not just crying. Grief is anger. Grief is other things. And so watching it in another person, I can say, okay, wait, that person is acting out of grief. Give them some space for a minute, because we might get upset with someone for certain behaviors when it's actually a grief response. We think it's something else, but I think that we forget there's so many facets to the grief process. And having watched it in people I care about, yeah, just giving people a little bit of space to have that time to grieve in their way.
So of all the topics we've talked about, it's interesting, this kind of ties them together. The suffering and death and sorrow. Grief is our reaction to all of those things. This just seems very close to the heart. And to live is to grieve, but to grieve is to learn in some fashion, and so that we can love better by entering into other people's grief, which means that we grieve some more and we learn some more. It's just and it's going to be that way. We never escape that. Not in this world. We have a hope for a world where there's no more tears, but we're not there yet. Hannah Hernard wrote a book, Hind's Feet on High Places. I never actually read it, but she's got great quotes, and I thought I might end with something she said. She said, it's comforting to think that our tears are put in a bottle. Do you know that psalm? God has our tears in a bottle. It's comforting to think that our tears are put in a bottle and not one of them forgotten by the one who leads us in paths of sorrow. I think it's powerful. Whatever comfort is, even God enters into our sorrow and knows it well. So you were carrying out, among other things, Capenda, love it, to love. It's a verb, as Cindy has said. Certainly means to enter into the grief of others. And I appreciate you sharing your stories and your wisdom today, and look forward to our next opportunity to talk about hope. Thank you both very much. We hope you have found this episode of An Unlikely Gift to be a source of hope to you as you walk through all of life's challenges and joys. If you'd like to be a part of the meaningful work Capenda is doing, visit our website at www.capenda.org. That's Kupenda. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next week as we explore the topic of hope.